Enemy at the Gates then by the Gamers, part of the Operational Combat series. Here we are off and running. Just done the sort of initial Soviet-Russian first turn, partway through the first turn, because these turns are going to take a long time. And especially until things settle down. That's taken me a few hours to get things kind of set up and then understand what I'm doing and so on, make artillery attacks and what have you. But it is enormously good fun. It's such good fun, it's unbelievable. Anyway, you can see from the exploitation markers down here that the Russians are having quite a happy time of it. They got roughed up in a combat over here, but apart from that, things have gone pretty good for them, as they should do, since they get to pick really choice attacks in this initial turn. So they've got some exploit markers there, so they're going to have some more fun. They didn't touch Stalingrad apart from to lob some rockets in and DG a Panzer division in there. Then up over here in these Romanians you can see exploit markers riddled through this. This is where Russian troops have picked good high odds attacks, got a decent roll, and just ended up with exploit markers all the way through here. And so they've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 stacks now that are going to just, some of which are going to get to roll into open ground. This one here can just overrun the artillery and then probably the HQ beyond it. This one here is just going to get to rip through some artillery and a breakdown unit. These guys here are just going to rough up a breakdown unit and roll forward, and so on. And they are going to have punched a hole 10 hexes wide through the front here by the time they get finished, or they should have done. And that's roughly where I wanted them to be. I didn't think they'd be sprinting out across this open terrain. It was just opening up a nice big gap, wider than the Germans can cover with their reserves, basically, is what they wanted to do. There's going to be some scrambling around after this to try and create a defensive line, probably behind this river, which is currently frozen. But yeah, this is where we're at. The weather roll is such that there's no flight allowed at the moment, so the planes are grounded, which is probably suiting the Russians. They could have used some air power. I think air power going into this would have been overkill. They had so much artillery. It was a case of whether to burn the supply to use it rather than wanting or needing artillery factors around. You've got more artillery than you've got supply for, both sides probably. And the Germans are really, Germans, Italians, Romanians, they're very thin on supply up here. So yeah, they're going to have an interesting time trying to work out how to respond. But I'm still having fun with the Russians rolling through here and getting just to blast things out of the way. It's quite a refreshing change after Reluctant Enemies, which was often something of a slog. Here you've got enough factors to get stuff done, and it's a case of whether you want to pay the supply for them. Anyway, that's we're midway through the Russian part of turn 1. Here we are at Stalingrad then, in Enemy at the Gates by the Gamers. And the Russians have completed their part of the first turn, something like 19th to the 21st of November 1942, and punched through the Romanian lines here and made a bit of a mess of what was there, and bust through to take this rail line, which was pretty much as expected. So they've not done anything spectacular, but they have cleared a path through to begin cutting the 6th Army off from supply. Up on the sort of flanks here, you can see a big breakthrough here, sort of 50 miles of front with not much left in terms of defenders. There are still a couple of German hedgehogs being held by Romanian troops under there, but they won't last long out of supply like that. However, you know, it's not the wildly successful breakthrough that the Russians could have got. And historically, the Russians completed the encirclement at Kalach here on what in game terms would be turn 2, November the 22nd, and the Russians are a long way from completing that. You see they'd have to get down here and get up from there. It's not impossible, but you know, the Germans now have a turn to make that as difficult for them as possible and keep their supply lines open for as long as they can. They've also got this turn, you know, just to use their incoming supply and their rail movement to drop. And you know, if they want to, they can drop another 20 supply or something into Stalingrad, and just so that it can hold out that much longer if and when the encirclement does finally come. So, you know, they can make this, their job is to make this really painful for the Russians to try and win. And, you know, they are really tough, really well dug in. And if they can have supply as well, that's going to be awful hard to shift. So that's the German plan, potentially. But they do have to look at other, you know, other options as well with regards to pulling back, how they're going to defend here, how they're even going to get sort of a sustainable supply source. I mean, if they pull back, where are they going to use as a depot? Because, you know, a lot of this stuff isn't particularly strong. This is often aircraft, and this is rubbish, I think, under there. So where are they going to put a depot? Where are they going to put supply that they can draw upon? Where is actually defensible? So the Germans have to ask those kind of questions, and those aren't easy. At the same time, Stalingrad is, you know, they can declare it a fortress and lock themselves into it, but in doing so they also lock a lot of Russians into encircling it. So it's a mixed bag doing that. The best option for them would be declaring it a fortress to lock the Russians into encircling it without it actually being encircled, so that they can keep it in supply and keep, you know, really grinding. That might be horrible for the Russians. So that was a lot of fun launching that attack for the Russians, but I'm concerned that they didn't make more progress, and I think they should have done. And now the Germans get to respond and take up some, you know, better defensive positions. It's enemy at the gates. It's the start of the German turn. I've just rolled for their variable reinforcements and their supply. And this is really the first time, and that's why I'm recording, this is the first time I've really had a look at the board from the Axis German perspective. You know, you do a lot of free setup with the Russians and you're trying to plot and plan, whereas the German setup is pretty much all stick the right forces in the hexes you're told and get on with it. So this is the first opportunity I've really had to look at their position and start considering what I should be doing. And wow, their position is really complex. I mean, yeah, precarious and complex. And while I may not have had a massively successful opening turn with the Russians, the the German situation here is just going to take a certain finesse to handle, I think. So I thought with the Russians not being able to cut this railroad down into Stalingrad in the opening turn, which is what I was aiming to do, I thought that would mean that the Germans could simply rail in a load of supply from way over off in the distance there in Kharkov. That's where their stuff is arriving. I thought they would be able to just rail that straight down into Stalingrad and therefore fortify Stalingrad, really effectively. However, the railhead stops here. So the Germans have some work to do in terms of they've got carts and they've got things turned into extenders, so that costs half their movement points to turn back into sort of carts and then truck round to here, and then they wouldn't be able to move any supply that got railed in here. And I can't find any trucks for them to use to go out and pick it up. It's possible that I'll find some, but at the moment it looks like they're going to really struggle to get supply that's railed into the railhead actually down into this area, which wouldn't be a problem if it weren't for the fact that there was a spearhead of Russian armour heading in that direction. So it's not exactly safe to leave supply line around here. Now the Germans aren't completely without resources. I mean, they have 29th motorised there, so a powerful sort of division there, and within Stalingrad itself 24 Panzer and 16 Panzer, so they have resources that they could direct round here, but protecting their supply route in for a turn and blocking off this Russian attack is not a foregone conclusion, not an easy manoeuvre to pull off. At the same time, the Germans, I think, have to expect the rail line to be cut next turn. In this area, it's just not looking good at all. There's nothing in the way of the required force to stop this lot. There just isn't. I mean, they're the big looking stacks, but a lot of them are filled with, they might be filled with aircraft or any old nonsense, but the only actual fighting stacks in here are 22nd Panzer, which has about 16 or 18 factors in it, split amongst 4 or 5 units, and 14th Panzer down here, which has about 12 factors split between 3 units. The Romanian 1st Panzer Division got its arse handed to it essentially by 26th Tank and 1st Guard Mechanised in the Russian attack. Got totally beaten up and driven back a couple of hexes with serious losses. And so you can see here, there's 26th Tank, 1st Guard Mechanised, 1st Tank. There's 3 big corps rolling forward there, and there's more stuff down here, and there's more stuff in reserve if the Russians want to throw it forward. They even held a couple of corps back because they didn't want to overextend. So yeah, it's looking shaky in this area, and the point of all that is to say, well, as the Axis, where did this lot go? Where do they, clearly sticking around is not the plan, but where do they go? Where are they going to say they're forming their next line? That's the decision they've got to make. Are they coming this way to try and reinforce Stalingrad? That seems like a very, very bad proposition, because Stalingrad is soon going to be cut out of supply. So the alternative is to go this way, and then, so they essentially have to pick somewhere as a base, as a spot. I suppose this Cheer River might be a natural sort of defensive line. It's not a great defensive line, being a minor river, but it might do. So it looks like falling back behind the Cheer and seeing what happens might be an option. And then the next line is coming back here, and then you've got the Donets back there, which they don't want to fall all the way back to the Donets, but I think they have to fall back behind the Cheer River to try and preserve some force, and accept that Stalingrad gets cut off, and try and do their best this turn to get supply into Stalingrad and defend against this. So what it's looking like at the moment is we might get a sort of half pocket where the Russians are cutting the supply routes into Stalingrad, but there might be an area here where the Germans are able to hold and there's not actually a surrounding Russian force. So yeah, things are going to get very interesting very quickly, I think, both tactically and strategically. Anyway, I'm just making I'm idle speculation here, but I'm having to do some speculation on behalf of the Germans just to see what their kind of plan is. And really I'm sort of fumbling around in the dark, just trying to make sensible decisions. So hence the vague attempts at strategizing to see how things might pan out. Anyway, that's where I am. It's the end of the Russian phase of turn 2. Here at Enemy at the Gates, Russians chose to go first, and yeah, mayhem as expected. Quite a difficult situation to keep track of. I mean, unlike in sort of Reluctant Enemies or here, where you've got things like this, where you've got these very close packed and very clearly delineated lines. What we've got here is a Russian breakthrough that initially happened in this area, just demolished the Romanians that were there with their opening turn, and then these Romanian troops and those that were left really didn't have enough movement to get out of the way and tried just to fall back to a river line to give themselves a bit of protection. You can see the Russians just, I mean, because the Germans fell back out of these hedgehogs here, these are now Russian occupied, and fell back towards Stalingrad to try and remain in supply. There was just a huge hole, and you can see the Russians have just sort of steamed through it. They've got cavalry there and an extender and protected HQ there, but then they've got, you know, armoured brigades here and an armoured corps up there, and they've got two mechanised and a tank corps charging up parallel to the Don, you know, threatening to cut in behind the Italians up there. And there's a very, very fluid breakout going on here where it's really not clear who's going to be in supply and when and how they're going to get themselves back in supply and so on. It's all fascinating, really, really amazing sort of mayhem going on that I'm just totally not used to after Reluctant Enemies, where there's a very, very obvious lines of battle and supply and so on. Here it's so fluid, it's unbelievable. However, the Russians have cut the rail line into Stalingrad in numerous places. You can see it's cut here, it's cut down there, it's cut here, it's cut up here. So there's absolutely no way. They've got 4 different sort of armoured units at various places, and they've cut this rail line as well. So there's no supply now going into Stalingrad. You can see the beginnings of a ring of troops around it. The Germans fell back towards Stalingrad, or German troops close enough to make it in, because there simply weren't enough troops to defend the rear here. This front portion was very strongly defended, but this rear area with the HQs and the Air Force and all the supply in it was looking a bit barren. So they've got some pretty tough infantry divisions, and they've managed to absorb some break down units to come back to full strength. So they've got some real tough units in there. They have just had a infantry division badly roughed up, but and they've got 14th Panzer here, although 14th Panzer is particularly, well, not particularly strong, but anyway, so we've got this the net closing in around Stalingrad here, because the Germans really didn't have much choice. The breakout here in the first turn was so wide and extensive, there was just no way to cover it all. The forces that were available just weren't. There were no forces around to actually re-establish anything like a line. It was just chaos. So some of the troops had to fall back towards Stalingrad. Some had to sort of siphon back up here as fast as they could get away, just try and get out of this initial sort of blast zone and try and re-establish some supply. But now you can see that there are Russian, armoured corps in pursuit of both of these roads, and the German Axis position here could unravel to the extent that the Russians can keep their troops in supply. That's their problem. It's just actually, trying to reach out far enough and keep them in supply. But I could see these guys blasting all the way up this road into this area, and similarly having a go at capturing Morozovsk pretty quickly. So the Germans have got a real tough situation here to deal with. Really, really ugly. Very nasty indeed. So it's huge fun. It's huge fun. It's quite an undertaking each turn, not just not just the doing of it, but even the sort of getting your head into the space and thinking about it and formulating something that looks remotely like a plan and trying to balance whether things are worth doing with how much supply they're costing, stuff like that. Because that's the other thing about comparing this with Reluctant Enemies, to come away from Reluctant Enemies, where a big attack might cost you like 3T or a supply point. Here a big attack can be costing you, I don't know, you can burn 15 supply in an area without even thinking about it. On the first turn there was about 15 supply, I think, in there. I think by the end of it there was about 2. These 75 Zero Katyushas cost 2 supply to attack with. These 26 strength barrage point artillery, that's a supply point to fire them. And then you go in with a tank corps or something, and that costs you, a supply point to fuel it up, and it costs you another supply point to attack with it. And all of a sudden, you fired a couple of artillery shots, and you've fueled up a couple of units and done a couple of fights, and you've burnt 8 or 9 supply. And then you maybe do an exploit, and you've burnt another 2. It's frightening how easy it is to spend. So I took with the Russians a sort of, if you've got it, flaunt it kind of strategy on the opening turn. I thought, they're all geared up for this huge attack, let's just do it. But now they're having to rein it in a bit and not be quite as cavalier with their supply points and actually pick and choose their attacks. And I've tried to do that a bit more this turn, but obviously, they've got a lot to do, and they need to be making steady progress, especially now where they've got this opportunity while the Germans, the Axis, and the Germans and their allies are in something of disarray. So Germans to do next, and I've got something of a supply nightmare for Stalingrad to deal with, because they're going to have to probably declare the Stalingrad fortress, and it could be some significant work doing the initial count up of what that lot is costing to supply from eating off the map and so on, looking that this could be significant work, like I say. So nasty. But other than that task, it's hugely enjoyable, and I've really got to try and figure out what the Axis are doing here, because they are unravelling, and they need to find some troops around or some way to stop things from unravelling, and I may have to do a lot more work with these Italians to try and form something of a barrier along maybe this this river here, whatever that's called, the Calia. You know, maybe something like that has to happen. I don't know what, but something more has to happen than what they did in the initial turns. So didn't foresee the danger of the Russians breaking out in this direction quite so quickly, and now they've got to scramble around and do something about it.